The Annotations in the Attic, Chapter 1. My father, Robert, was a man of quiet habits and scholarly pursuits. He was a history professor, his life immersed in the stories of the past. Yet he rarely spoke of his own. He had a vast library, walls lined with books on every subject imaginable, each volume carefully chosen, meticulously organized. After his passing, his library was a tangible link to his intellectual world, a space filled with the scent of old paper and the quiet weight of knowledge. When my mother passed away a few years later, the task of going through their belongings, of dismantling the life they had built together over 6 decades, fell to me, their only child. I'm Clara. I'm 60 years old now, a retired teacher, living a quiet life after my husband passed away a few years ago. Being an only child, the sole heir to my parents' legacy, felt both like a heavy responsibility and a poignant journey through the remnants of their lives. Their house, filled with familiar objects and the echoes of shared memories, was a repository of a history I thought I knew completely. While sorting through my father's extensive library, a task that felt both daunting and deeply personal, I came across a section of shelves dedicated to local history, books about our town, the surrounding region, its past, its people. These were books I had seen before, familiar spines on the shelves, but I had never paid them much attention. As I took the books down one by one to dust them and pack them away, I noticed something unusual about a small, unassuming volume titled Early Settlers of Oak Haven. It was an older book, its cover worn, its pages yellowed. As I opened it, a faint, distinctive scent of pipe tobacco, my father's scent, rose from the pages. But it wasn't just the scent that caught my attention. The book was filled with annotations in the margins, notes in my father's handwriting, small comments, questions, cross-references to other books or documents. This was unusual. My father was meticulous with his books, treating them with reverence, rarely marking them. The annotations were sporadic at first. Small notes about early families, local landmarks. But as I flipped through the pages, the annotations became more frequent, more focused on one particular family, the Millers. My father had made extensive notes about the Miller family history, tracing their lineage, their connections to other families in the area. Why such an intense interest in the Miller family? They weren't part of our family history, not that I knew of. They weren't prominent figures in the town's founding. As I read my father's annotations about the Miller family, I noticed a pattern. His notes became more detailed, more personal when he reached a specific generation, focusing on a man named Thomas Miller, born in the 1930s. My father had noted birth dates, marriage dates, places of residence, almost as if he were trying to trace this Thomas Miller's life with an unusual intensity. Then, I found an annotation in the margin next to an entry about Thomas Miller marrying a woman named Sarah. The annotation was a single word, written in a hand that seemed shakier than usual, underscored twice, lost. Lost. What did that mean? Lost how? Lost track of? Lost to history? Or lost in a more personal, more tragic way? Flipping further through the book, I found more annotations related to Thomas and Sarah Miller, to their lives in the early 1950s. My father had noted addresses, places they lived, jobs they held, and then an annotation next to an entry about a child born to Thomas and Sarah Miller. The annotation was a date, April 12, 1958. And below the date, a single word, written with a heavy hand, David. April 12, 1958. The date David was born. David Miller. My father's intense interest in the Miller family, his detailed notes about Thomas and Sarah, his annotation lost next to their marriage, the date of their son David's birth, and the name David, it all hinted at a hidden connection, a secret buried within the history of the Miller family, a secret my father had been investigating, perhaps even a secret he was a part of. But what was the connection? How were Thomas and Sarah Miller and their son David connected to my father? Why was he so intently tracing their lives? And why the annotation lost next to their marriage? I searched for other books in my father's library that were related to the Miller family or to Thomas and Sarah Miller specifically. I found a few more local histories, and in each I found similar annotations in my father's handwriting. Notes about the Miller family, about Thomas and Sarah, about the date April 12, 1958, and the name David. It was clear my father was not just researching local history. He was researching a specific story, a specific family, a specific event connected to a child named David Miller, born on April 12, 1958. My father's personal history before he met my mother was also largely unknown to me. He rarely spoke of his family, his childhood, his life before he settled down with my mother. His parents had passed away when I was very young, and I had no other close relatives on his side. The only stories I knew were the ones he chose to share, often humorous anecdotes about his university days or his early career. The annotations in the history book felt like a breadcrumb trail leading into a hidden part of my father's past, a past connected to the Miller family and a child named David. The scent of pipe tobacco, strong in the pages of the history book, felt comforting, familiar, yet now carried a new weight of mystery, hinting at a secret my father had carried in silence, a secret he had perhaps been trying to understand, or perhaps even trying to conceal. Who was David Miller? How was he connected to my father? Was he the key to understanding the annotation lost? Was he a hidden relative, a half-sibling? The possibility sent a shiver down my spine, a feeling of rewriting the history of my own life, my own family. Chapter 2.1. My father's meticulous annotations in the local history books, his intense focus on the Miller family, particularly on Thomas and Sarah Miller and their son David, born on April 12, 1958, painted a picture of a man researching a hidden story, a secret intertwined with his own past. The annotation lost next to the entry about Thomas and Sarah Miller's marriage felt particularly significant, hinting at a separation, a disappearance, or a profound change in their lives that my father had been investigating. Who was David Miller, born on April 12, 1958? How was he connected to my father? Was he a relative? A half-sibling? The son of a sibling of my father? The possibility of a hidden family member, a lost branch of our family tree, was both overwhelming and deeply compelling. My father's own past, before he met my mother, was a blank canvas to me. He rarely spoke of his childhood or his family. This made tracing any potential connection to the Miller family challenging. I decided to focus my research on Thomas and Sarah Miller and their son David. Where did they live? What were their lives like? And what happened to them that prompted my father's annotation, lost? I used online genealogical databases, searching for records of Thomas and Sarah Miller, looking for their marriage date, birth dates, places of residence, and any information about their son David. I found records of a Thomas Miller marrying a woman named Sarah around 1957. Their birth dates aligned with the time frame. They were listed as living in a town not far from my own, a small, rural community. And I found a birth record for a son named David Miller, born on April 12, 1958, in that town. The dates, the names, the location, it all matched the details in my father's annotations. Thomas and Sarah Miller were real. Their son, David, was real, born on the exact date my father had noted. But what happened to them? Why did my father annotate lost next to their marriage? Did something happen to Thomas or Sarah? Did they disappear? Did their family fall apart? I searched for death records for Thomas, Sarah, and David Miller. I found a death record for a Thomas Miller who passed away in the early 1970s, his age aligning with the Thomas Miller born in the 1930s. The location of his death was in the same region where he had lived with Sarah and David. I found no death record for Sarah Miller and no death record for a David Miller born on April 12, 1958. The absence of a death record for Sarah Miller and her son David felt significant. Did they disappear after Thomas Miller's death? Did they move away? Did something happen to them that wasn't officially recorded? The annotation lost next to Thomas and Sarah's marriage seemed less about a death and more about a separation, a disappearance, a severing of ties. Did Sarah and David disappear from Thomas Miller's life? Or did they disappear from something else entirely? My father's notes in the history book, his intense focus on the Miller family, suggested a personal connection, a reason why he was so invested in tracing their lives. Was he connected to Thomas Miller, or to Sarah Miller, or to their son David? The possibility that David Miller, born on April 12, 1958, was a hidden relative, perhaps even my half-brother, a son my father had before he met my mother, was a constant, unsettling thought. Could my father have had a relationship with Sarah Vance? My mother's maiden name was Vance, but her first name was Margaret Eleanor, leading to the birth of a child, David, with Sarah Miller? The timeline felt off. My parents met in the late 1950s. If my father had a son in April 1958, it would have been just before or around the time he met my mother. Was this a secret he carried from before their marriage? The meticulous nature of my father's annotations, the depth of his research into the Miller family, suggested a connection that went beyond mere academic curiosity. He was searching for something or someone connected to Thomas and Sarah Miller and their son David. The scent of pipe tobacco in the pages of the history book, the familiar scent of my father, now carried a new weight of mystery, hinting at a secret that had been buried for decades, a secret intertwined with the lives of the Miller family and a child named David. I needed to find out more about Thomas and Sarah Miller's lives after 1958, about what happened to Sarah and David after Thomas's likely death in the early 1970s. Did they move away? Did they disappear? And most importantly, how were they connected to my father? Chapter 2.2. The absence of a death record for Sarah Miller and her son David after Thomas Miller's passing in the early 1970s suggested that they had either moved away or their fates were somehow obscured from public record. My father's annotation, lost, next to Thomas and Sarah Miller's marriage record, felt increasingly like a description of their disappearance from his life, or from something significant, rather than a death. The possibility that David Miller, born on April 12, 1958, was my half-brother, a son my father had before or around the time he met my mother, was a constant, unsettling thought. Could my father's intense research into the Miller family be a way of tracing the life of his own child, a child he had lost contact with, a child whose existence was a secret kept from his later family? I decided to focus my research on tracing the lives of Sarah Miller and her son David after the early 1970s, after Thomas Miller's likely death. Where did they go? Did they build a new life elsewhere? Were they aware of my father, of his potential connection to them? Finding someone who disappeared from public record decades ago is challenging. Privacy concerns and incomplete historical data make tracing individuals difficult. However, with the advent of online genealogical databases and people search websites, it is sometimes possible to find faint trails of individuals who sought to remain hidden. I used these resources, searching for records of a Sarah Miller, born around the late 1930s or early 1940s, might have lived with a son named David, born on April 12, 1958, after the early 1970s. The search was broad, yielding many possibilities, but no clear path to the specific Sarah Miller and David Miller from my father's annotations. The annotation "lost" next to Thomas and Sarah Miller's marriage in my father's book felt increasingly like a key to understanding their disappearance from his life. What happened around the time of their marriage, or shortly after, that caused a rift, a separation, the sense of being lost to my father? I decided to explore my father's life in the period leading up to and immediately following April 12, 1958, the date of David Miller's birth. Where was my father living in 1958? What was his life like? Was there any indication of a significant relationship around that time, a relationship that might have resulted in the birth of a child? My father's life before he met my mother, in the late 1950s, was largely unknown to me. He rarely spoke of it. I had only vague information about his activities during that period, his studies, his early career. I decided to try and find any old friends or acquaintances of my father's from that era. People who might have known him before he met my mother. People who might have known about his life in 1958, about any relationships he had. My father's closest friends from his later life I knew, but his friends from his younger years were unknown to me. The task of finding people who knew my father 60 years ago was challenging. Many were likely gone. Those who remained might have moved away, or their memories might be faded. However, through research into old university yearbooks and alumni networks, I was able to identify a few individuals who were contemporaries of my father's, who attended the same university around the same time. I contacted a few of them, explaining my research into my father's early life and asking if they knew him, if they had any memories of his life in 1958. Most of the individuals I contacted had only vague recollections of my father, a quiet, studious young man. However, one individual, a retired professor named Thomas Ashton, remembered my father more clearly. They had been roommates for a time in university. I arranged to speak with him, hoping he could shed some light on my father's life in 1958. Mr. Ashton was a kind, elderly man, his memory sharp and detailed. He spoke of my father with affection, remembering him as a dedicated student, a good friend. When I asked him about my father's life in 1958, about any relationships he had, Mr. Ashton hesitated, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Robert," Mr. Ashton said softly, using my father's first name. "Yes, 1958. That was a difficult year for Robert, a period of uncertainty, of a difficult decision." My heart pounded. A difficult decision, uncertainty. What was he talking about? "There was a young woman," Mr. Ashton continued, his voice low. "Someone Robert cared for deeply. A relationship that became complicated. Difficult circumstances. A pregnancy. A pregnancy. My father." In 1958, a young woman named Sarah, Mr. Ashton said. "Sarah Miller." My breath caught in my throat. Sarah Miller. The same name as the woman in the Miller family fire. The wife of Thomas Miller. But the Miller family fire was in 1955. This was 1958. Sarah Miller, I repeated, the name resonating with a new, confusing significance. "Did they have a child, Mr. Ashton?" Mr. Ashton nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yes," he said, "they did. A baby boy, born in April 1958. They named him David. David Miller, born April 12th, 1958. The date in my father's annotation, the name, his son, my half-brother." It was a difficult situation, Mr. Ashton explained. Robert was young, still in university. Sarah, her circumstances were also complicated. They weren't married. The pressure to do the right thing in those days, it was immense. They faced a difficult decision. Unmarried parents in 1958. The shame, the societal judgment, the uncertainty of their future. What choice did they make? Did they marry? Did they keep the baby? Or did they make a heartbreaking choice? "They decided," Mr. Ashton said, his voice filled with sadness, "to place the baby for adoption. It was a painful decision for both of them, but they believed it was the best option, to give the baby a chance at a stable life, a life free from the difficulties they faced." David Miller, my half-brother, born on April 12, 1958, was given up for adoption. My father, Robert, and Sarah Miller, his first love, were his biological parents. This was the secret my father had carried throughout his life, the secret he had been researching, the secret hidden in his annotations, in his intense focus on the Miller family, on Thomas and Sarah Miller, the parents of his son David. The annotation, "Lost," next to Thomas and Sarah Miller's marriage in my father's book, wasn't about Thomas and Sarah themselves being lost. It was about David, lost to them, lost to his biological parents through adoption. And the Miller family my father was researching was not the family of the fire, but the family of Sarah, the mother of his son. Sarah Miller, the woman in the locket, was the same Sarah Miller who was my father's first love, the mother of my half-brother, the locket, to M. Always remember, April 1955, from Sarah. Likely a message to her own mother, M. Perhaps a family name or initial. A message about remembering something significant that happened in April 1955, perhaps related to her life before she met my father. My earlier theory about the locket being connected to the Miller family fire was likely a misinterpretation, a convergence of names and dates in my fragmented search. The truth was more personal, more profound. My father had a son, a half-brother I never knew about, a son he had given up for adoption, a secret he carried in silence for over 60 years. Chapter 4.1 The Revelation from Mr. Ashton. My father's former roommate. That my father, Robert, had a son, David Miller, born on April 12, 1958, with his first love, Sarah Miller, and that they had placed David for adoption due to difficult circumstances was a profound and emotionally devastating truth. My father, the quiet, scholarly man I knew, had carried this secret throughout his life, a secret that had shaped his past and, unknowingly, mine. The annotations in his history book, his intense research into the Miller family, were a way of staying connected to the life he had given up, to the son he never knew. The annotation lost next to Thomas and Sarah Miller's marriage was not about their disappearance, but about David, lost to them through adoption. The initial confusion regarding Sarah Miller and the Miller family fire in 1955 was a consequence of names and dates overlapping in my fragmented search. The Sarah Miller my father loved and had a son with was a different Sarah Miller from the one who perished in the fire. However, the locket with Sarah Miller's photograph, inscribed to M, always remember, April 1955, was still in my mother's hidden box, along with the newspaper clipping about the 1955 fire and the fabric swatch. This suggested that my mother was connected to the Miller family fire in 1955, a separate secret from the adoption of my half-brother in 1958. Perhaps the woman in the locket was a different Sarah Miller, connected to the fire, and my mother had her locket for reasons yet unknown. Or perhaps Sarah Miller in the locket was a deliberate misidentification, a way of protecting another secret connected to the 1955 fire. The complexity of my mother's hidden life was immense, revealing layers of secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. The secret of my half-brother, David Miller, given up for adoption. The secret of her connection to the Miller family fire of 1955 and the mysterious locket. Each secret a separate thread in the intricate tapestry of her past, woven with difficult choices, love, loss, and the burden of unspoken truths. The focus, for now, remained on finding my half-brother David Miller, born on April 12, 1958, and given up for adoption. He would be a man in his 60s now, living a life unaware of his biological father, unaware of the family he came from. Finding someone given up for adoption decades ago is challenging, as records are often sealed. However, with the advent of commercial DNA testing, there was a strong possibility of finding him, or finding close relatives who could lead me to him. I had already submitted my DNA for analysis. My DNA results were in, and I had a predicted first cousin match, David M. My initial theory that M stood for Miller, and his mother was Sarah Vance Miller, my mother's hidden sister, was one possibility, connected to the Miller fire mystery. But with the new information from Mr. Ashton about my father's son, David Miller, born in 1958 and given up for adoption, the M in David M's name took on a new, profound significance. Could M stand for Miller? Could David M be my half-brother, David Miller, connected through my father? The predicted relationship of first cousin from the DNA test seemed to contradict the possibility that David M was my half-brother, who would be a sibling. However, the predicted relationships from DNA tests are sometimes inaccurate, especially for more distant relationships. It was possible that first cousin was an error, and he was actually a closer relative. Or perhaps the M in David M's name stood for something else entirely, and the DNA match was through a different branch of the Miller family, a branch connected to my father in a way I didn't yet understand, or even connected to my mother's hidden sister, Sarah Vance Miller. And the fire. The complexity was immense, the possibilities intertwined and confusing. I reached out to David M. through the DNA database, explaining my research into my family history and the possibility of a connection to a David Miller born in 1958. I mentioned the names Robert Vance, my father, and Sarah Miller, his potential biological mother. I was careful not to reveal the full truth of the adoption or my belief that he was my half-brother initially. Wanting to approach the sensitive topic gently, while waiting for a response from David M., I continued to research Sarah Miller, the mother of my half-brother. Mr. Ashton had known her in 1958, but he didn't know what became of her after David was placed for adoption. Did she move on? Did she marry? Did she ever reconnect with my father? The locket with the photograph of Sarah Miller and the inscription, "To M, always remember, April 1955, from Sarah." And the newspaper clipping about the 1955 fire remained a separate, unsolved mystery. The possibility that this was a different Sarah Miller connected to the fire, or that Sarah Miller in the locket was a deliberate misidentification related to the fire, added another layer of complexity to my mother's hidden life. The plain wooden box in my mother's closet was a Pandora's box of secrets, each discovery leading to more questions, more possibilities, more layers of a hidden past that was far more intricate and filled with unspoken truths than I could have ever imagined. Chapter 4.2, The DNA Match with David M., and the information from my father's former roommate, Mr. Ashton, about my father having a son named David Miller in 1958 with Sarah Miller, given up for adoption, created a swirling vortex of possibilities and confusion. Was David M. the same David Miller? Was he my half-brother? The first cousin prediction from the DNA test felt like a frustrating discrepancy, potentially hindering a direct connection. While the mystery of my half-brother's identity and whereabouts remained, the other secrets contained within my mother's plain wooden box continued to demand attention. The locket, with the photograph of a woman identified as Sarah Miller, the inscription, "To M, Margaret, always remember, April 1955, from Sarah," the intricate fabric swatch, and the newspaper clipping about the Miller family fire in 1955. These were fragments of a separate, unfolding mystery, connected to my mother's hidden past. I decided to put aside the search for my half-brother for a moment and focus on this other secret, the connection to the Miller family fire. The locket given to my mother by someone named Sarah in April 1955, the same month as the fire that reportedly claimed the lives of Thomas, Sarah, and Lily Miller, felt like a tangible link to that tragedy. The inscription, "Always remember," suggested a memorial, a reminder of something significant that happened in April 1955, something connected to Sarah and to my mother, Margaret. The discrepancy in identifying the woman in the locket as Sarah Miller by some older residents in the town of the fire also lingered. Was the photograph not of the Sarah Miller who died in the fire? Was it of a different Sarah Miller? Perhaps a relative of my mother's, connected to the fire in a different way? I decided to revisit the details of the Miller family fire in 1955. The undetermined cause, the rumors of a desperate plan, of arson, the possibility that the fire was not a simple accident, but a deliberate act gone tragically wrong, a way to escape financial ruin, to disappear and start over, felt increasingly likely, and the possibility that a child Lily, their daughter, was caught in the flames, or that someone else survived, their existence concealed, was a chilling one. The fabric swatch with its intricate rose and vine pattern remained a puzzle. Could it be a piece of fabric from something found in the ruins of the fire? A piece of clothing that survived, a memento of the tragedy, a tangible link to the night everything changed. I contacted a local historical society in the town of the fire, inquiring about any surviving artifacts from the Miller family home. Any items that were recovered from the fire that might be in their collection or in private hands. They had a few items, some charred photographs, damaged furniture, but nothing that matched the description of the fabric swatch. The silence surrounding the fire, the undetermined cause, the swift reporting of the deaths, all hinted at a deliberate effort to close the case, to bury the truth. Who was involved in this? The local authorities? The surviving relatives? Or someone else entirely? The locket given to my mother by someone named Sarah in April 1955, and the message, "To M, Margaret, always remember," suggested that my mother was privy to a secret connected to the fire, a secret that was unfolding in April 1955. Could Sarah, the person who gave her the locket, be a survivor of the fire? A survivor whose existence was concealed? The DNA match with David M. remained a key piece of the puzzle, a potential link to both mysteries. If M in David M's name stood for Miller, and his mother was Sarah Vance Miller, my mother's hidden sister, then his existence as a survivor of the Miller fire, contrary to the newspaper report, meant his mother, my aunt, also survived. And his being a first cousin meant his mother, Sarah Vance, was my mother's sibling. The two mysteries were intertwined through my mother's hidden sister and her family's fate in the 1955 fire. I reached out to David M. Again, sharing more about the Miller family fire research, the discrepancies in the newspaper report, and the possibility that his mother, Sarah Vance Miller, survived the fire, and that his existence was concealed. I also shared the information about the locket given to my mother by someone named Sarah in April 1955. I was careful to present this as a complex family mystery I was trying to understand, emphasizing my desire to find the truth and connect with any hidden family. David M. was understandably overwhelmed by the new information. The possibility that his mother, Sarah Vance Miller, survived the fire that reportedly claimed her life, and that his own existence was somehow concealed, was a lot to process. He was open to hearing more, to exploring the possibility, but he needed time to absorb the shock and the implications of these revelations. The plain wooden box in my mother's closet had indeed been a Pandora's box of secrets, unleashing a torrent of hidden truths and emotional complexities. It seemed my mother's life was filled with more layers of hidden histories, more unspoken sorrows, more difficult choices than I could have ever imagined. Chapter 5.1. The investigation into the secrets contained within my mother's plain wooden box had led me down a complex and often emotionally challenging path, revealing not just one, but two intertwined family mysteries. The first, the secret of my twin brother, Thomas, born with me in 1962, and given up for adoption was a profound personal revelation that reshaped my understanding of my own life. The second, the secret of my mother's hidden sister, Sarah Vance Miller. Her connection to the tragic Miller family fire in 1955 and the hidden survival of her son, David, was a larger, multi-generational mystery, revealing layers of desperation, potential crime, and a deliberate cover-up. The DNA match with David M. and the information from my father's former roommate, Mr. Ashton, had confirmed the truth about my twin brother. My subsequent message and connection with Thomas Foster, the man who was my twin brother, was a profound and deeply emotional reunion. A story of two lives separated by a secret for 60 years, finally finding each other. The first cousin prediction from the DNA test was likely an initial error, or perhaps reflected a complex or slightly more distant biological relationship than anticipated. But the subsequent communication and shared birth date confirmed the sibling connection. Simultaneously, the mystery of my mother's hidden sister, Sarah Vance Miller, and the Miller family fire continued to unfold. The locket from Sarah to my mother, to M, always remember. April 1955, and the newspaper clipping about the fire were tangible links to this separate, tragic story. David M., the predicted first cousin through DNA, was indeed David Miller, the son of Sarah Vance Miller, the survivor of the fire, who was reportedly deceased. His existence as a first cousin confirmed that his mother, Sarah Vance Miller, was a sibling of either my mother or father. Given my father was an only child, Sarah Vance had to be my mother's sister. The two mysteries were intertwined through my mother, Margaret Eleanor Vance. She was the mother of my twin brother, given up for adoption, a secret she kept. And she was the sister of Sarah Vance Miller, a survivor of the 1955 fire whose existence was concealed, a secret she was likely involved in keeping. The complexity of my mother's hidden life was immense, revealing a woman who carried the weight of multiple profound secrets. Secrets born of difficult choices, societal pressures, and perhaps a desperate act connected to the Miller family fire. The investigation into the 1955 fire, the rumored arson, the undetermined cause, the reported deaths versus the hidden survival continued. David Miller, my first cousin, the son of Sarah Vance Miller, was a key figure in this part of the story. He had grown up knowing little about his mother's past or his father's family, aware only of a vague family difficulty. Now he was learning the truth of his origins, the tragic events of 1955, and the secrets that had shaped his life. The intricate fabric swatch, the rose and vine pattern, remained a puzzle. Was it a piece of fabric from Sarah Vance Miller's dress? A memento of her? Perhaps a piece of evidence connected to the fire or her escape? The locket, the inscription, the fabric, the newspaper clipping. They were all fragments of a story my mother had kept hidden. A story of a sister's survival, a tragic fire, and a secret that bound them together. The plain wooden box in my mother's closet had indeed been a Pandora's box, unleashing a torrent of hidden truths and emotional complexities. But in facing those truths, in bringing the stories into the light, we were also finding connections, understanding, and a path towards dealing with the legacy of the past. My life, which began with a mother's hidden box and a feeling of unspoken mystery, had been profoundly changed. I had uncovered the truth about my twin brother, found him, and connected with him. I had also discovered the existence of a hidden sister of my mother's and was unraveling a separate family mystery connected to a tragic fire decades ago. The plain wooden box, once a symbol of my mother's hidden sorrow, was now a symbol of truth revealed, of connections found, of a family finding its way back to a form of wholeness, embracing its hidden branches and the lives that were shaped by secrets and difficult choices. The journey was not over. The story of my mother's hidden sister, Sarah Vance Miller, her life after the fire, her relationship with my mother, and the full truth of what happened the night of the 1955 fire, still held unanswered questions, mysteries waiting to be fully revealed. But I faced the future with a sense of purpose, guided by the knowledge that the truth, however challenging, deserved to be known, and that family connections once lost could be found again, weaving together the fragmented pieces of the past into a tapestry of understanding and connection in the present. Chapter 5.2: The secrets unearthed from my mother's plain wooden box had reshaped my understanding of my family history, revealing a complex tapestry woven with love, loss, difficult choices, and the weight of unspoken truths. The initial discovery of the locket, fabric, and newspaper clipping hinting at the 1955 fire was just the first layer of a multi-generational mystery that connected to my mother's hidden sister and unexpectedly to the secret of my own birth as a twin. My twin brother, Thomas Foster, found through DNA analysis, was now a tangible presence in my life, a connection that filled a void I hadn't even known existed. Our reunion, after 60 years of separation and silence, was a profound and deeply emotional experience, a testament to the enduring power of family bonds. We were building a relationship, navigating the complexities of being newly found siblings, sharing stories, filling in the gaps of our separate lives. Simultaneously, the mystery of my mother's hidden sister, Sarah Vance Miller, and her connection to the Miller family fire of 1955 continued to unfold. David Miller, my first cousin, the son of Sarah Vance Miller, was a key figure in this part of the story. His existence, contrary to the newspaper report of his death in the fire, was undeniable proof of a deliberate cover-up. The locket from Sarah to my mother, to M. Margaret, always remember, April 1955, was a poignant link between the two sisters and the tragic events of that year. The intricate fabric swatch, the rose and vine pattern, still held a subtle mystery. Could it be a piece of fabric from Sarah Vance Miller's dress, a memento of her, perhaps a piece of evidence connected to the fire or her escape? I continued to research vintage fabrics, hoping to find a specific origin or history for the pattern. The Miller family fire of 1955 remained a central point of investigation. The rumors of arson, the financial difficulties of Thomas Miller, the undetermined cause of the fire, the reported deaths versus the hidden survival, all pointed to a desperate plan that went tragically wrong. The loss of Thomas Miller and their daughter Lily in the fire was a devastating reality, whether accidental or a consequence of the desperate plan. My mother, Margaret Eleanor Vance, the woman who carried these secrets throughout her life, was a complex and profoundly sad figure. She had made difficult choices, both regarding her twin son's adoption and her sister's survival and subsequent hidden life. Understanding her motivations, the pressures she faced, the love and fear that likely guided her decisions, brought a sense of compassion and sorrow for the burden she carried in silence. The plain wooden box in her closet, once a symbol of her hidden sorrow, was now a symbol of truth revealed, of connections found, of a family finding its way back to a form of wholeness, embracing its hidden branches, and the lives that were shaped by secrets and difficult choices. The journey of uncovering these secrets was not just about uncovering the past. It was about understanding the present, about finding a path towards healing, towards forgiveness, and towards building a future that acknowledged and honored the intricate tapestry of our family history, the mystery of my mother's hidden sister, Sarah Vance Miller, her life after the fire, her relationship with my mother, and the full truth of what happened the night of the 1955 fire still held unanswered questions. Was Sarah Vance Miller still alive? If so, where was she? Had she ever reconnected with my mother? The DNA connections had opened doors to hidden branches of our family tree. Perhaps further DNA matches or continued genealogical research would shed more light on Sarah Vance Miller's life after 1955, or on the full truth of the fire. The legacy of my mother's secrets was immense, revealing a family history far more intricate and filled with hidden depths than I had ever imagined. But in facing those truths, in bringing the stories into the light, we were also finding connections, understanding, and a path towards dealing with the legacy of the past. The locket, the fabric, the newspaper clipping, the hidden journal, the empty bassinet. These objects, seemingly disparate, were all connected by a common thread: the power of family secrets, the weight of unspoken truths, and the relentless way the past finds its way to the present, demanding to be heard, demanding to be understood. My life, which began with a mother's hidden box and a feeling of unspoken mystery, had been profoundly changed. I had uncovered the truth about my twin brother, found him, and connected with him. I had also discovered the existence of a hidden sister of my mother's, and was unraveling a separate family mystery connected to a tragic fire decades ago. The plain wooden box, once a symbol of my mother's hidden sorrow, was now a symbol of truth revealed, of connections found, of a family finding its way back to a form of wholeness, embracing its hidden branches and the lives that were shaped by secrets and difficult choices. The journey continues, guided by the echoes of the past and the hope of finding more pieces of the puzzle, more connections, more understanding, weaving together the fragmented pieces of a hidden history into a tapestry of connection and understanding in the present.